It was supposed to be the start of a promising military career, but for 4 young recruits at Deepcut Barracks in Surrey, it ended in them taking their lives. The deaths happened between 1995 and 2002 amid claims of abuse and bullying. Whilst the army treated all of the deaths as suicides, each of the families disagreed, leading to the families pushing for further inquests. In a moment, we'll meet Stewart Thompson, who was at Deepcut during that time and says the bullying he witnessed there led to him having a breakdown. First, let's remind ourselves what happened at Deepcut. Over the years, thousands of army recruits have gone through the Deepcut Barracks in Surrey for their basic army training. Between 1995 and 2002, 4 young army recruits died from gunshot wounds in unexplained circumstances at Deepcut. They were 20-year-old Sean Benton, 18-year-old Cheryl James, 17-year-old Jeff Gray, and another 17-year-old James Collinson. The deaths came amid claims of widespread abuse and bullying at Deepcut. The army treated all of the deaths as suicides, but each of the families disagreed. The families pushed to have fresh inquests into their deaths. In February this year, there was a second inquest into the death of Cheryl James. Last month, it concluded she took her own life, but acknowledged there was a highly sexualised culture at Deepcut. There were also serious failings in the care and supervision of trainees. A recent ruling means there may be a fresh inquest into the death of Private Sean Benton. Well, Stewart Thompson was just 20 years old when he was at Deepcut as a fresh-faced army recruit. He was there at the same time as Private Sean Benton, who died of 5 gunshot wounds to his chest in 1995. After leaving the military, Stewart began to suffer flashbacks and underwent 4 months of therapy to help deal with the trauma of what he witnessed. He has never spoken about what he experienced until now and is with us today for his first ever interview. Thank you very much for coming and talking about what happened at Deepcut. Take us back, first of all, though, to when you arrived at Deepcut, a 20-year-old recruit, presumably optimistic about what your future might be in the army.
Yeah, we arrived there, you know, full of hope and excited. I think the issue for a lot of recruits arriving there from Pirbright, which was where we all did our basic training, was the place felt like a demotion when it should have felt like an elevation and a promotion, because it was labelled as second phase training. You deserved to be there. You'd gone through the basic training, but it was far more difficult. And that was unsettling for a lot of people, and you know they didn't cope well with it. It was very difficult. When I compare the regime at Pirbright to Deepcut was far more brutal. Mm-hmm. The brutality was kind of more insidious, unexpected. Whereas at Pirbright, you know, if you made a mistake, you were punished, and you expected that.
So, we were just looking at pictures of you when you arrived at Deepcut, and 6 years after that, you had a breakdown, and you put it down to what you experienced at Deepcut. You were talking there about the brutality that you experienced at Deepcut and how it was different from what you'd ever experienced before. Why was it 6 years on that you pinpointed that particular period for the breakdown that you had?
Well, it happened when I was at university in the early 2000s, and I think at that point, Deepcut started to appear more and more in the media. So I started to think about it. I'd not thought about it for years, and I started to have nightmares about it, and I used to think about all the people that I'd met. I mean, I wasn't targeted personally. I was very fit there. I was one of the fittest there in B Squadron when I arrived there in March. But the problem was a lot of people there were targeted, and they were bullied. They were targeted by the instructors, singled out. People used to come to my room, a lot of the younger recruits. You know, there were kids there who were 17, 18. Some of them couldn't iron clothes, they couldn't look after themselves. You know, personal hygiene was an issue for them, excuse me. And then, you know, people used to come to my room and ask for help, and you know, it was a crazy period. Literally, people were hiding under the beds to try and escape from instructors. You know, they would do anything to escape from the regime, including myself. I was back squadded around the same time as Sean Benton because I failed my Category C licence. They used
that
to send
was a
people,
driving
yeah,
licence.
it was a driving course up at Leconfield in Hull. And I was sent back to Deepcut in March, so I spent almost 6 months there, a long time, around about the same time as Sean. And it was in that second time when I arrived back there in the March. The regime seemed to have changed. It was harder. I didn't know anybody there. You didn't. It was the kind of place where you didn't make friends with people very easily because everybody was paranoid, and there was a lot of fear there.
So Sean died later of gunshot wounds, and we will talk more about Sean in a moment. But first, I'd like you to really tell us exactly the sort of things that you saw, because you say that you weren't personally picked out for ill treatment, but you saw it going on. So what were the worst things that you were seeing?
For example, we used to get pulled out of our beds at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, and you had to wear your number 2 dress, which was your, the smart brown uniform. You had to wear that. You were put on parade at 1 o'clock in the morning for no apparent reason. And it was during some of those parades that some of the instructors physically hit and abused recruits for absolutely no reason. I know things like that happened in the 70s and 80s. It was normal, but by the time you got to the 90s, I believe that the military had changed and instructors were not allowed to touch recruits. But it did happen at Deepcut, and I witnessed that, and it happened to several people.
I mean, obviously, when you go in for military training, you expect it to be tough.
Of course.
But what was it particularly that crossed the line between tough and something that you and others found much harder and darker to deal with?
I think it was, as I touched on at the beginning, because it was second phase training, a lot of people were confused. Pirbright, of course, Pirbright was brutal, it was difficult, but you expected it to be difficult. It's military training, it's not supposed to be easy. It tests you physically and psychologically, but you expect to... Deepcut was built up to be a place of education, which it was, because we spent 2 or 3 weeks at the School of Logistics studying for our trade training. It was built up to be this place of promise and promotion, but it wasn't like that. You were treated often like you were dehumanised completely. No identity, no freedom. You were not allowed to leave the camp during the week unless you were on. You could only leave the camp at weekends unless you were on guard duty. There were no locks on the doors of your room, your accommodation, so anybody could walk in at any time. So it was a completely different atmosphere to Pirbright. I think that, again, that confused people because you expected it to be a better place, because Deepcut was the place where you were sent to your units, to your job, so to speak.
So, some of the things that have emerged previously in an independent review into the deaths at Deepcut have included things like an instructor riding a bicycle over a recruit because they were apparently too fat, trainees having razor blades put in their boots, and individuals being slapped, kicked or punched. You've described seeing individuals slapped, kicked or punched.
Absolutely.
What about the other things? Did you ever see anything like that?
No, I didn't. This is why I say it was insidious, because it was unexpected. I think the instructors singled out people. They did it privately, they did it in rooms, they did it when often a lot of people weren't there. So it was... and something very, very differently. For me, it got so bad that I had a small group of friends, only 2 or 3 of us, and we literally used to lock each other in cupboards. The cupboard was literally, in Deepcut, was the only place where the instructors couldn't access, because it was your private property, and every cupboard had a padlock and you had the key. So you could only lock it from the outside, and we used to lock each other in the cupboard. I literally spent hours in the dark, sat in a cupboard that one of the other recruits had locked me in, and we had an agreement to take it in turns. We used to do that during the day.
So why would you do that?
I think it was to escape the daily activities. The daily activities were meaningless. At Pirbright, where you were doing your basic training, everything was systematic, and there was a reason for everything, whether it was physical training on the ranges, learning to use a rifle, nuclear, chemical, biological warfare, everything. There was a programme to follow at Pirbright. But at Deepcut, it wasn't like that. During the day, you know, you'd have a parade early in the morning, and then people would be split into different groups. Some people would be washing clothes, some people would be peeling potatoes, some people would be cutting grass, others would be doing physical training, others would just be messed about on parade, guard duty, cleaning rifles. So it had no meaning to it. So it was completely chaotic, and it was psychologically, it was tiring, and mentally it was tiring. So, you know, we used to hide in the ceiling of, you know, the rafters at the top. You could push them up and climb into the rafters and put them back, and the instructors couldn't find you. There were only, as far as I know, there were only a few people at Deepcut that knew about that.
I mean, obviously to do something like that is extreme, but when you're sort of talking about the daily duties, which sound almost more mundane than anything sort of highly pressurised, it's hard to understand why that led to such an extreme reaction amongst the recruits. Can you kind of go back to the state of mind that you were feeling at that time, and that everybody else was feeling around you? Were you aware that you were all buckling under pressure?
I think no, because we were all very young, and I think also people, they didn't understand. They expected and tolerated it because they thought this was the military. For me, it was only in retrospect, maybe a year or 2, 3 years later, I started to think, hang on a minute, that wasn't right. You know, that it was strange. It didn't feel right. Even at the time, it didn't feel right. But you were under so much stress, and you couldn't really speak to anybody. The first time I arrived at Deepcut, it was slightly easier because I arrived with friends, people I knew from my troop, from Pirbright. So you kind of had a bond with people. But because I was sent back from Leconfield in March '95, I arrived back at Deepcut. I didn't know anybody. I think there was only one other person, another recruit that from my troop in Pirbright. There were only 2 of us left. So it was paranoia. You were isolated. You didn't know people. You couldn't trust people either, because there was some of the recruits used to bully other recruits as well. Obviously, you know, a lot of it was about team building, and if you made a mistake, the instructors often punished everybody in that troop for the one person making the mistake. It was to foster, you know, team building. So I think often recruits that did struggle and were targeted were bullied by other recruits, either push them to leave the army, or to improve their own personal issues.
I mentioned that you were at Deepcut at the same time as Sean Benton, who died of 5 gunshot wounds to his chest in 1995. An inquest did record a verdict of suicide, although his family have questioned that, and they're in the process of trying to get a second inquest. The report that looked at what had been going on at Deepcut by Nicholas Blake QC concluded that there's no evidence that Sean had been bullied before his death, nor that he had ever complained of bullying to his close friends or anyone in authority. Any over-harsh discipline to which he may have been subject during his military career did not cause him to take his life. Do you accept that?
No, not at all.
Why not?
I disagree. I didn't know Sean on a personal level, I have to be honest, but I knew him well because we were there at the same time. In a weird kind of sense, we had parallel lives because we both were sent to Leconfield around the same time. We both failed our category C licence, and we were both sent back to Deepcut. But I witnessed Sean being singled out, and he was constantly punished, often for no reason, evidently. I couldn't see any reason. He was definitely singled out. Even his reputation preceded him. You know, you could often see him walking across the field or running across the field with an instructor shouting behind him because he was constantly punished. And I watched him change as well. His personality changed from when I first met him in October, November of 1994 to when I saw him in May. He changed, definitely. And in fact, I spoke to him in the cookhouse during breakfast maybe 5-6 weeks before his death, and he was a completely different person. You know, he was stuttering his speech, he was nervous. I can't remember what took place in the conversation because this is more than 20 years ago, but I remember him complaining, and he was angry and stressed, and he was criticising the trainers, and he changed as a person, so I don't accept the inquest report that he wasn't bullied. I think it contributed to his death.
You didn't talk about your experiences at Deepcut for a very long time. You had a breakdown 6 years on. You spoke earlier about what triggered that. It was kind of seeing it being talked about around you. Why didn't you talk about it?
It was a difficult subject to talk about. Even at Deepcut, you didn't really share really what you were going through personally, because you were in that environment where you couldn't really speak to anybody, because if you spoke about it, it would show a weakness and you'd be exposed, because the environment, you were a recruit, you had to be tough and prove yourself, and also there wasn't really anybody to speak to at Deepcut. Certainly 6 or 7 years later, it was hard for me to talk about it. It was something that I didn't want to share with other people. I didn't want to burden them with the news. But by that time, we had issues in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan had kicked off. Iraq was starting to start as well. So it just didn't seem appropriate to talk about it at that point, because there were soldiers being killed in Afghanistan and things like that. So I just bottled it up, and I had the breakdown. And
you've said that nothing else that you did subsequently in the military was as bad as your experiences?
Oh, absolutely not.
At Deepcut?
No.
Did you went to the front line, did you?
Yeah, well, I was logistics, and I ended up being sent to an ammunition depot in Warwickshire, and I spent 3 years there. And then I also served in the war in Bosnia in '96 and spent time in Germany.
So Deepcut was worse than the war in Bosnia?
Absolutely. But I mean, it seems ironic to say, in a jokey sense, Bosnia was great. It was, you were there with your unit, you had a great time with your friends, everybody looked after each other, and you were treated as a human being. You were treated with respect and professionally. My job was ammunition supply specialist. So that was a great career. But Deepcut was different. It was like a prison. It was a completely different place.
Would you like there to be a public inquiry into what happened at Deepcut?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I can, looking in hindsight on what's been said over the years, I understand that the instructors were short-staffed and they had issues themselves. They had a lot of recruits to look after, but that doesn't justify the way they treated. There were some instructors who said recently, that they had the recruits' best interests at heart, but I don't accept that, because I witnessed recruits being bullied for no reason, or they were forced to do things that didn't have a reason.
Because some might say, well, if you can't sort of deal with a really tough regime, maybe you shouldn't be in the military. What would you say if somebody said that?
Yeah, I mean, I can accept that. People make mistakes, and you're told to stand to attention and put your back against the wall. Or you've got to carry heavy items, or you're on the floor doing press-ups. That's fine. Pirbright was difficult. Don't get me wrong. It was meant to be difficult, but like I said at the beginning, Deepcut was like a demotion. It should have been an elevation. You were treated worse than what you were treated in basic training at Pirbright, and I think some of these kids that were there, they were 17, barely out of school, 18. So I think psychologically for them, to feel like they were demoted and dehumanised was psychologically difficult to deal with. I mean, if that was how the regime was planned, then it doesn't make any sense to me, at all.
Kylie has tweeted, the bravery of Stewart talking about his experiences at Deepcut this morning is admirable. Sam has tweeted, I'm ex-forces. Stewart Thompson should be listened to by the MOD. He's speaking for the guys who are not with us anymore. Tweet from Charlotte, obviously I'm sympathetic to the horrors they experienced, but surely the pressure they were under would be higher on the front line. Trevor has tweeted, I did my basic training at Deepcut. It could be brutal, and yes, some bullying, but plenty of us got through it okay.
So did I. I got through it okay, and I went to my unit and I coped. But that does, just because you cope, that doesn't necessarily mean on the inside mentally that you're coping. Outwardly, people are fine, but you might not be. I was great. I had a good military career. I left the military with an exemplary record. as I said, the regime was brutal, and it was unaccountable. It didn't seem normal. I can accept, yeah, it's got to be difficult. This is how the front line is, but there were 4 deaths there. So there needs to be an inquest into those, because as far as I'm aware, the inquests at the time weren't conducted properly.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there have been inquests and a subsequent inquest into one of the deaths, and potentially another one will be reopened. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming in and joining us. We did ask the Ministry of Defence for their response to Stewart Thompson's experience. They sent us a statement. It says, General Sir Nick Carter, the head of the Army, has publicly committed to improving the Army's culture to ensure that the Army is demonstrably inclusive, that it respects difference and is a beacon of equality and of opportunity. Still to come, the BBC finds that NHS consultants are racking up thousands in overtime. One doctor took home an extra £375,000 last year on top of their salary. As France suffers yet another Islamist terror attack, we'll ask people there how their lives have changed since the wave of attacks began. Let's catch up with all the day's news with Anita in the BBC newsroom. Anita.
Thanks, Joanna, and good morning. President Francois Hollande is meeting religious leaders this morning to discuss the wave of Islamist terror attacks in France. It's emerged that Adel Kamish, one of the attackers who killed an 85-year-old Catholic priest at his church in Rouen, had been wearing an electronic tag, but it was turned off under his probation conditions. Churches in the UK have been warned by police to review their security arrangements. The UK economy grew by 0.6% over the last 3 months. The latest gross domestic product figures have just been released, and we'll get more on this shortly with our business correspondent Ben Thompson. The overtime bill for consultants in UK hospitals has risen by more than a third in the past 2 years. An investigation by the BBC has found that one doctor earned an extra £375,000 over 12 months. Hospitals have blamed a shortage of consultants and rising demand. The Department of Health says it will work to make changes to consultant contracts in order to reduce overtime bills. Hillary Clinton has become the first woman in US history to be nominated for president by any major party. She was endorsed by the Democrats at their national convention in Philadelphia, but there were protests from supporters of the defeated candidate, Bernie Sanders. There's a warning about a possible spike in immigration to